Good evening, I'm Dennis Ward. Welcome to APTN National News. A women's halfway house for those involved with the justice system was opened in Whitehorse last year, but just a year and a half later, its doors have temporarily closed. Sarah Connors tells us why.
This women's halfway house in Whitehorse was hailed as the first of its kind in the north when it opened in early 2023. But now, the building sits empty. The government-funded Dakini Haven Women's Home, located next door to the Whitehorse Correctional Center, was operated by the nonprofit Connective. It has space for up to 8 women transitioning through or out of the criminal justice system, like those on supervised release. Earlier this month, Yukon Health and Social Service Minister Tracy Ann McPhee told the territorial legislature that the program had been put on pause at the end of September. She said 7 women were enrolled in the program, but all but one had left to deal with their issues elsewhere. She said the program wasn't very successful and that putting it on pause was the right course of action.
We have a facility at Dakini Haven that can house people.
However, the Council of Yukon First Nations Executive Director Shadell Chambers disagrees.
This program ending and really impacts Indigenous women.
The council partnered with Connective to provide cultural supports for the program because Indigenous women are overrepresented in the justice system.
It's really important that we do have a program available for women so that they have an option other than incarceration. So they have opportunities to connect with their children, attend programming in the community, and get access to supports and services.
McPhee says the government is evaluating Connective supportive housing programs, including the women and men's halfway house programs. The evaluation will determine whether or not the programs are effective and meeting outcomes. The evaluation is expected to be completed by February 2025. Sarah Connors, APTN National News, Whitehorse.
Thanks, Sarah. There is an ongoing dangerous persons alert in northern Saskatchewan in the Thunder Rapids area. RCMP from multiple detachments are on scene searching for 3 or 4 men who shot someone north of Prince Albert while stealing their vehicle earlier this morning. RCMP are asking the public to stay indoors and urging those outside to avoid picking up hitchhikers, as the suspects who may be wearing black bandanas or balaclavas are considered armed and dangerous. The initial alert said the men were traveling in a white 2020 Dodge Ram 1500 crew cab, but they are believed to now be on foot. At the time the alert was issued, the men were believed to be heading north on highway number 123 toward Cumberland House. The National Indigenous Collaborative Housing Incorporated announced the recipients for the critical need for safe and affordable housing projects in Atlantic Canada. Indigenous Services Canada will provide over $33 million to fund 6 projects in Atlantic Canada, including the Taiwak Housing Association in Nova Scotia, the Native Council of PEI, and Happy Valley Goose Bay. The funds will be distributed by NICHI, an Indigenous-led national housing organization. It supports urgent Indigenous-led housing needs in rural, urban, and northern areas. According to the 2021 census, over 170,000 Indigenous peoples live off reserve across Canada and need housing. The Atlantic recipients were just one of several announcements made this week across Canada, totaling almost $300 million in funding. It's supposed to build more than 3,800 housing units over the next 2 years. To election news now, and until 1960, status First Nations people in Canada were not permitted to vote in provincial or federal elections. Now, during the provincial election in Saskatchewan, the new Democrat Party is urging the Indigenous community to get out and vote. Saskatchewan's official opposition party, the NDP, announced a commitment to work with First Nations and Métis leaders to implement Truth and Reconciliation Commission calls to action and missing and murdered Indigenous women and girls' final reports on a provincial level. Betty Nippy-Albright, the NDP candidate for Saskatoon City Centre, is seeking re-election. She notes that Indigenous peoples did not see themselves represented in the legislature in previous elections. Issues affecting them were ignored. This time, she's representing Indigenous peoples and their issues at the provincial level. Nippy Albright calls the Indigenous voting population a sleeping giant that must be awakened.
This is an opportunity to make your voice matter, to tell the governments that your voice will no longer be muzzled, it will no longer be ignored, and that the issues that you bring up and that you're impacted by will be raised.
Voting week has already begun in Saskatchewan, with polls open till October 28th, which is Election Day, but the polls will be closed on Sunday the 27th. Members of the Blood Tribe are due to elect their new chief and council in just over a month. Some voters have been protesting for weeks outside the band office, asking for a firm date. And this week, they finally got an answer. CTV's Quinn Keenan has more.
The Blood Tribe election is supposed to be held on or before November 27th. That means it should be called by Friday to kick off a 30-day election period. But for a group of band members, the process hasn't been transparent. They have been protesting outside the Blood Tribe administration building since last week to voice their frustrations.
While there's no transparency coming out of the office, there's not enough information coming out to the public in regards to a set date for nominations, and therefore the members are still waiting to see if we are going to have an election.
Normally there's 2 weeks of nominations followed by 2 weeks of campaigning. But with just 37 days until an expected election, some worry time is quickly running out for candidates and voters.
There's no notice sent out whether or not they're going to have any elections, so there's no transparency coming out. But we are here to, to protest for an independent election.
This isn't the first time Blood Tribe voters have been frustrated with an election. The 2020 election was marred by long lines that prevented many from voting. The polling station in Calgary was also moved just a day before the election, causing several people to miss out on the chance to vote. Protesters are hoping for more transparency and a smoother process this time around.
All I want is fairness from the top. How come they can't talk to us? How come they won't come out and talk to us? We've been out here since last Friday. Nobody comes out to talk to us. So I don't know what's going on in there. Hopefully we get an election soon.
The Blood Tribe didn't respond to our requests for an on-camera interview over the past 2 weeks. Late Monday, the Blood Tribe Council suddenly issued a notice of election for November 27th, with advanced polling November 20th. Quinn Keenan, CTV News, Standoff.
On Friday, U.S. President Joe Biden is expected to formally apologize for the United States' role in the Indian boarding school system, a system that the United Nations defined as, quote, an element of genocide against Indigenous people. According to the United States Interior Department, at least 973 Native American children died in those institutions, with that number expected to rise as its investigation continues in the years to come. From 1819 to 1969, the United States forcibly removed more than 18,000 Native American children, some as young as 4 years old, from their home. They were forced to attend Indian boarding schools where they experienced years of physical, mental, emotional, and sexual abuse. Similar to what happened in Canada, the schools were part of a state effort to assimilate the children and dispossess them of tribal nations and land. So far, 74 grave sites have been documented at the more than 500 institutions. No U.S. president has ever formally apologized for the boarding schools and the removal of Native American children that also included Alaskan and Hawaiian Indigenous children. Cody Grote is Mohawk and an assistant professor at the Department of History and the Indigenous Studies program at Western University in London, Ontario.
I think it's an important milestone in United States history. I think one thing that's really important for us to understand is presidential apologies are so much more rare than apologies we see here in Canada on behalf of the Prime Minister. I think this is one of only 3 or 4 presidential apologies to ever be issued. So the fact that it is for something so significant as Indian boarding schools, I think is a huge milestone in the future of United States Indigenous relations. We're 88 days left in the Biden administration, and I think we have 2 things happening. If you look at the press release from the White House, it's very much framed as a Biden-Harris accomplishment. So some of it is setting the stage for Kamala Harris. Perhaps it's trying to encourage some votes from Native Americans in the lead up to the election. But we also see Joseph Biden redefining his legacy, or trying to define his legacy very clearly. And he's making much more bolder actions in these last few months of his presidency. So I think it's a mix of those. But of course, the influence of Secretary of the Interior Deb Haaland, the first Native American to be appointed to the presidential cabinet, we can't deny that. She's been working since 2021 on the federal Indian boarding school initiative.
And we hope to bring you more from the apology tomorrow. Coming up after the break, our Truth in Politics panel will be here to discuss where things go next with First Nations child welfare reform following the rejection of one of the biggest proposed settlements in Canadian history. Stick around. Welcome back. There is a big question mark around what is going to happen with First Nations child welfare reform. 1 week after a vote to reject a proposed $47.8 billion settlement. In fact, few are even willing to speak about it, turning down interview requests and only issuing statements. Our Truth in Politics panel is, however, willing to talk about the vote and what happens next. Jennifer Leywitz is a partner with Pasqua Harbor Strategies. And helping us out this week is Andre Bear, a board member of the First Nations Child and Caring Society. Jennifer, Andre, thanks for being with us this week. Special thanks for helping out, Andre. We'll start with you. As you spoke at the Special Chiefs Assembly last week, and mentioned that you thought the final settlement agreement continued discrimination against First Nations children. Maybe a little on that and your thoughts on the deal being rejected.
Absolutely. Yeah, I think all of our experts had agreed that if we accepted the deal as is, discrimination of our children would have continued for many reasons. And I highlighted a little bit in my speech, but I think it was clear that Ontario had a greater interest. They had more lobbying power because their lawyers were negotiating the deal. And so we've seen that their remoteness factors were potentially higher than other remoteness bans. And so that's great for Ontario and for their children. But this is the point of the agreement, is to end discrimination for all children, right? And so I really hope that Ontario has their own deal someday. But as for all the other regions across Canada, I think we need to find something that is more reflective of the needs of all of our children. And I think we need certainty when it comes to the Canadian Human Rights Tribunal orders, and having those orders become the floor, and then we negotiate up from there.
Jennifer, it's been a week since the vote. The National Chief hasn't spoken to media yet about this. Indigenous Services Minister Patty Hajdu hasn't done any interviews. Seems to be a lot of questions about what happens next. What do you think has been going on over the past week, I guess?
I think there's been a lot of confusion over what happens next. I think it almost feels like the AFN and the government are just saying, well, you guys figure it out then. And it's like our chiefs and leadership across the country are being treated like they made the wrong mistake by the AFN and Canada because they were fighting for a better deal. And I think that was one of the biggest issues in the room, is that the chiefs and leadership just felt like they were not consulted on enough and that it was too urgent. That was one of the number one things I was hearing was, why the urgency? Why the urgency? Like, we know that this deal, has been coming off of a decision made in the makes of over 2 decades. Like, this is not a new thing. And on the stage, I heard the AFN lawyers say, this isn't new. We've been working at this for so long, for over 5 years. Well, then why the lack of consultation, and why now the urgency? We know that there's an ever-changing political climate, but why should that affect, at the end of the day, the services and the agreement that our children from CARE deserve?
Andre, you know, both you and Jennifer were in the child welfare system. What do you think needs to happen to ensure First Nations children on reserve are no longer discriminated against in this system?
I think that if there's ever going to be a time in our history or in our future that we ever see statutory funding, I think this is the moment. I think this is the time where statutory funding is required to ensure that no First Nations children are discriminated against within the child welfare system. And I don't think that the number, it could have been $50 billion, it could have been $60 billion. But the point is, we need something that is certainty in law, and to me, that's statutory funding for First Nations children to ensure that discrimination of them never happens again.
Jennifer, what do you see politically happening here next? You know, a lot was made of a possible election looming. There's clearly a divide amongst chiefs over this deal. What do you think is going to happen next?
You know what, I don't know. I know that there is obviously a lot of concern with the change of government potentially coming, and it is very unfortunate that as First Nations people, what happens at a federal level, even provincially, affects us. And it's like we have to bend over backwards to make these deals happen as quickly as possible and to work with the new incoming governments. And it's almost like starting relationships over again. Even though it's supposed to be a nation-to-nation agreement with Canada, there are those political divides in there and those dynamics that we have to continuously work through. And it's frustrating, and I feel bad for our leadership that constantly have to deal with new people and lobbyists to even form these relationships and get things done.
Andre, you, like I said, had grown up in the child welfare system, and there was a lot of confusion, I think, made last week, or maybe on purpose or not, but that, you know, the $23 billion in compensation that is going to be going to children and their families who grew up in the system or were impacted, that money wasn't going to flow. Can you maybe straighten that out for us and confirm, you know, that's a different thing, that money is still, that program's moving forward?
Yeah, so I didn't grow up in the system. My mom was fortunate enough to sober up long enough to get me back, but I was in and out of care. However, the compensation is out the door. So the $23 billion that is for children that were discriminated against is going to come. That's already out the door. And I think there was a lot of fear mongering during the at the AFN, saying that the compensation might be impacted, when in reality it had nothing to do with the compensation that was already out the door. This was specific to long-term reform.
Jennifer, your thoughts on that? Do you think that there was this was maybe purposely done, making it seem as though there wasn't going to be any compensation for those in the child welfare system if this $47.8 billion deal was rejected?
I think so. I think there was a lot of urgency and fear mongering that was happening, and I think there was also the component of, you know, a lot of confusion as well. Like at one point I was standing there and the votes were done for the day, and there were chiefs standing around thinking like things were going to continue. There was a lot of confusion, and that was unfortunate. And I actually heard from a chief as we were walking out, he's like, I don't even know what just happened. And they're like, did we just vote that down? Like it was like there was so much confusion. And if I'm confused and everyone next to me is confused, that's a problem. And that tells me that not only were things confusing at the AFN assembly, but also everything leading up to it where there wasn't proper enough communication. And don't get me wrong, the AFN were hosting these, you know, long Zoom meetings, but it's still, at the end of the day, I sat on those Zoom meetings and I was still confused. There was a lot of confusion, and I think there was a lot of wording to place that responsibility back on the leadership, saying, you voted for this. You wanted to do this with the agenda. This is what you asked for. And it's almost like they were doing that to build their argument for themselves that they could fight back on this, and the leadership that called them out if they wanted to.
Jennifer, Andre, we'll have to leave it there, but thanks so much for being with us this week.
Thank you.
Where things go next with the child welfare reform is also one of the topics on tonight's episode of Nation to Nation. We'll get a preview of the show after the break. Welcome back. Time now for our photo of the day. Loki the kitty cat is starting early this year by dressing up for Halloween. Thanks to Shania Murdoch for sending in a picture of her favorite feline. You be sure to send us a photo to share at aptn.ca if you'd like to be featured as our next photo of the day. Now let's take a look at your Friday weather forecast. Starting on the East Coast, 12 in Fredericton, showers and 11 in Halifax. Snow and 4 in Kuujjuaq, sun's out and 5 in Nain. 11 in Montreal, rain and 9 in Val-d'Or. 12 with showers in Sault Ste. Marie, 11 with rain in North Bay. 11 with rain in Thunder Bay, 6 with showers in Sioux Lookout. Rain and +4 in God's Lake, 6 above in Norway House. Sunny and 10 in Winnipeg, 9 under sunny skies in Dauphin. 10 in Regina, sunny and 8 in North Battleford. 7 and sunny in Meadow Lake, 6 in La Ronge. In northern Alberta, sunny and 2 in High Level, 4 under sunny skies in Fort McMurray. Sunny and 7 in Edmonton and Medicine Hat, 9 in Lethbridge. Cloudy and 12 in Vancouver and Victoria. 4 with showers in Prince George, -2 in Dease Lake. 18 below in Old Crow, -1 in Whitehorse. -5 in Yellowknife, -5 with showers in Norman Wells. 2 below with snow in Sax Harbor, -5 and snow in Pawlatuck. 6 below with snow in Chesterfield and Whale Cove. -11 in Resolute, -6 with snow in Arctic Bay. Time to head over to our Ottawa studio now, where Fraser Needham is standing by with a look at tonight's episode of Nation to Nation.
The final settlement agreement on long-term reform in First Nations child welfare was defeated at the Special Chiefs Assembly in Calgary last week. NDP MP Lori Idlow tells us what her party thinks should happen next. The Métis Nation Saskatchewan and Federal Housing Advocate released a report this week on Métis housing in that province. MNS President Glenn McCallum is here to talk about some of the report's recommendations. And First Nations firefighters were also in Ottawa this week to ask for greater supports from the federal government. Michael Conlon of the Okanagan Indian Band was there, and he tells us more. All this coming up after the news on tonight's episode of Nation to Nation.
Thanks, Fraser. Lots of important stuff coming up there, and you can catch Fraser, who will be back here in less than 2 minutes' time with tonight's Nation to Nation. We're all out of time for your APTN National News for this Thursday. Of course, for news anytime, though, you can visit our website, aptnnews.ca. And be sure to join Creason here tomorrow at 1 p.m. Eastern Time for your first look at the day's news. I'm Dennis Ward. Marcy McGuitch, thanks for being with us. We will see you back here tomorrow.